Yes, I've given this talk once before only, and today will be different because it's a very different kind of audience. And I'm preceding by a few hours a talk by Peter Victor this evening on the slower growth economy. The thing that Mette was referring to that we have not agreed on is the question of growth, whether growth can continue or growth cannot continue. Growth as measured by money is, in my view, irrelevant. It's not the proper way to measure prosperity or growth. Growth in terms of human population or in terms of continued increase in the use of primary resources will bring society to disaster and perhaps bring the planet to disaster. But growth in terms of more and better life for everybody, that is a kind of growth that can continue, even if it can only continue asymptotically. So I don't think I'm really in any basic disagreement with Mette, because neither of us had, when we had this minor disagreement, really defined in any precise way what we meant by growth. But you'll hear about growth from Peter tonight, and Peter Victor is also, to some extent, a mentor of mine in the question of economy, which is what this talk is about. It's about the fact that the present economy isn't working and cannot work. It cannot work. It's nothing to do with what Obama or anybody else does with money. It's nothing to do with that. It has to do with the throughput of resources and what can we do about it. But in order to make the picture clear, I'm going to give this talk in 4 stages. The first stage is the bad news. The second stage is what's the cause of the bad news, and it will turn out it's the economy. The third question then is, can we get from here to a new economy? And the answer is yes, conditionally, and I'll discuss the condition. And the fourth is what the new economy might look like. What will be its main features, which are essentially different from today. Okay, let's move on. The bad news is the Earth's predicament. And I'm asking all of you, who knows about ecological footprint? Good. How many people have heard of Bill Rees or know him? I know you do, Helmut. Okay, Bill Rees is the founder of the concept. He published, I think, the first paper in 1992, wasn't it, Helmut? And please, by the way, interrupt me and ask questions at any time. He's just retired from the University of British Columbia, and I'm trying to get him into Canadian Who's Who. He still isn't in Canadian Who's Who. Anyway, they've agreed to put his name in if he will send a CV. And he had a student about that time, about 1992, called Wackernagle, who graduated a few years later, and they published their first joint paper in '94. And since when, Wackernagle has started an outfit which I think is called Footprint News. He's got 15 people in an office in Oakland, California, and he's got offices in other places in the world, and the guy is a genius. And his Footprint News supplied, the definition of ecological footprint, or one very simplistic definition, and it's not the only definition, is it's the land area a community needs to continue its lifestyle divided by the area it actually has. And it's very easy to apply to ancient island civilizations. If you've, for example, read Jared Diamond's book, Collapse, Jared Diamond illustrates island societies that continued for thousands of years, and it's because they never let the population exceed what the island they lived on could feed. And so that's one definition, but I tend to think of more in terms of pollution than of land area or use of resources, and you'll see why in a minute. This is a very important map. I guess we can't blow it up, can we, can we get it bigger? Never mind. I'll get up and point at a few things. There are various shades of red in the map, and all the red areas in the map are countries which have overexpanded their use of resources. In other words, they're polluting too much. And the ones in the darkest red, which are Britain, Belgium, Netherlands, Britain, Belgium, Netherlands, Italy, Spain, and all the countries from Algeria through to Iran and possibly Japan. I don't know if Japan is one. Those countries need to reduce their pollution or their throughput of resources into waste by more than 60%. And in the case of the Netherlands, they need to reduce by more than 80%. Wow, yes. Those are the countries that are driving the Earth to its downfall the fastest. The next fastest include China and a few other countries. And the next, on the third line here, the ones who've exceeded their footprint by more than 50% are conspicuously the United States and India. And I'm going to focus on those two for a moment because they are a very good example. You see, the United States, for its land area, has a relatively modest population. And it can, as I shall show on the next slide, easily reduce its footprint to below the value 1.0, where it means they are living sustainably. For India, it is quite another problem. In India, most people already have a very modest standard of living, and the high footprint is due to the fact they have a very large concentration of people in an admittedly large area, but it's too small for the consumption and pollution that they produce. And they just don't have enough good farmlands, is another way of putting it. So they need a larger area. What's going to happen to India, I don't know, but I think they have no alternative but than to formulate a population reduction strategy, which they did once before, but it was a disastrous failure. Now, the next slide is a tribute to, oh, by the way, Canada is green, which means it's within its footprint, but that's only because it has a large area. If you take the footprint of any country and divide by the number of people, it gives you the footprint per capita. And Canada is the 4th largest in the world, which means we also need to cut back in a very similar way to the way the Americans do. And you will see how on the next slide, which I press here, right? Is that right? Good. This is a very ingenious work of years that was also sent to me by the Footprint News just recently. It shows the ecological footprint, and this green line here is the level 1.0. So as long as we're below that, we're okay, and if we're above, we're not okay. And we passed the 1.0 mark in 1970, according to Wackernagel's present estimates. I had thought it was much later than that, but it was fairly early. They've then divided all this into sectors of the economy. Don't ask me how they did it. I don't know how they managed to do this, but they've been working at this a long time, and they've quite a few researchers doing this. The blue is the greenhouse gas emissions. So if you could reduce the greenhouse gas emissions to 0, the Earth would be just fine. We'd be living well within our ecological limits. But as long as, and this is 2008, so we're a bit higher now, we've come up here a bit, okay? But so we absolutely have to reduce, for ecological reasons, the emission of greenhouse gases. Now, if these areas here go on getting worse, and they will because of the drying climate, then this point here could come up to here, in which case we're in real trouble. But at the moment, the prime thing that we need to do is get off oil and coal and gas, not burn so much, in fact burn extremely much less, and bring the footprint down from where it is now, which is about here, bring it down to about here. I like these things because they're numerical. You can read numbers off these graphs. And I'm a physicist, and we spend a lot of our time measuring numbers. And there are, just before we go on, I'll just re-emphasize what I said, that the ecological footprint of a region for any given lifestyle is directly proportional to the population. So population is always important, even though it may not be the dominant factor in a particular case. There are 4 other numbers I've been able to come up with, which are a result of the 7 years that we've had the Global Issues Project. The first one is very, very simple. If you extrapolate the present carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and you look at its rate of rise and the rate at which that rate of rise is increasing, you can show mathematically with a very simple graph that by 2027, the atmospheric carbon dioxide will reach the level 450 parts per million. And this may or may not be, but it's the best guess that scientists have at the present time, as to the point where the climate will go on warming until the ice caps have gone. Now, when the northern ice cap has gone on the planet, we're only going to have a sea level rise of 6 or 7 meters. But when the Antarctic ice cap goes, which will take some thousands of years, the sea level will rise 60 to 70 meters. And one of my recommendations to Science for Peace and to Pugwash is that they publish maps in the near future, get some geographer to do maps of what parts of the world will be flooded at these various stages. When the northern ice cap goes, the Greenland ice cap, and when the southern ice cap goes. Because I'm not sure whether the sea will come up to Castle Oma or not, but it's coming up pretty high. Okay, so in our very first roundtable in 2006, we established using a computer model, a very fine computer model called the GSS, that under laissez-faire, there won't be any big trees left by 2038. There'll be plenty of trees. Canada will be covered with trees, but there won't be any big ones like this that you can cut down for lumber. They will all have gone because of the intense pressure on Canadian and Russian forests once the tropical rainforests have gone. So we were able to, we repeated this several years later with more up-to-date information, and the date still came out 2038. When that happens, when that has happened to past civilizations, they have collapsed when they've lost their trees. Food, we did a food extrapolation on the same model in 2009 at a food and population conference. And today there are food shortages in various parts of the world. By 2040, it will be universal. I don't mean that every country will be short of food. Maybe Canada won't. But by and large, the world will be short of food. And it will be sufficiently short of food that people will be starving by sometime in this decade to the point where the population is reducing, not because of policy, but because of starvation. So 2040, 2050 is crucial in food, and the ocean wild fish will be gone by 2048. These are the 14 oceanographers who got together in 2006 to very bravely publish a paper saying that under laissez-faire, if we let things go on, there won't be any ocean fish by 2048 and the fishing industry will be gone. That's the end of the bad news. Aren't you relieved? The most important thing, this is a quote I thought from Václav Havel, the Nobel laureate who became president of the Czech Republic. He died, 3 years ago or something? 3 or 4 years ago. The most important thing is to study the reasons why humankind does nothing to avert the threats about which it knows so much. I kind of like that quote. And I do. Now, what are the reasons for the bad news? The primary reasons for the bad news are the overconsumption of primary resources, which is either too much consumption per person or too many people consuming at a more modest rate. The impact is the product of the two, how much you consume and how many people there are. In the United States, the high footprint is overconsumption, and in Canada, we have a low consumption, but we have a very high consumption per capita. What forms do the overconsumption take? The worst, as we saw on the blue graph there, the icing on the cake graph, is the burning fossil fuels. Production and sales of goods that are not needed, aided and abetted by addiction to shopping and by military production, and also by industrial, what's it called, when they sell you things that are faulty. What?
Planned obsolescence? Planned obsolescence?
Yes, planned obsolescence, thank you. Planned obsolescence is another one. A third one is bad agricultural, forestry, and fishing practices, and the fishing practices are very, very obvious, of course, because they're driving the oceans empty. And another one is excessive meat consumption relative to cereal and vegetable foods. Those are some of the reasons. There are lots of others, but these are important reasons, and the fossil fuel leads the lot because it's not just causing climate change, it's killing the ocean. And that's what Phyllis and I and others are hoping to put our minds to this year. So the measure is the degree of pollution, atmospheric, land, waters, and the ocean. What are the remedies? There are none within the current economic system. And the reason is that the economic system itself is designed to maximize the throughput, which is precisely what is causing the trouble. So this is echoed wherever you hear the need for economic growth mentioned. Most politicians and businessmen still insist that economic growth is essential, and that means more production, more throughput of resources. Can the economic system be changed? Yes, I believe it can. We need ecological economics, and it goes under several names. It's also called economics as if the earth matters, and biophysical economics, several other names. More recently, it's just called New Economics. And there's a New Economics Institute, and there's also a New Economics Foundation, which is funding the New Economics Institute. Can it work? Not as long as the present mindset persists. The mindset that we have to have more, we have to produce more, and the reason for money is capitalizing things is to produce more widgets so people can consume more.
Where is the New Economic Institute?
It's in the, it's either Massachusetts or it's on the Eastern Seaboard, but it's very spread out. The people they have, if you Google them, you'll find about 110 names, and some of them are big wheels, men or women with huge reputations, and some are little people working in a small community on microeconomics. So it's a very well thought out, what they're doing is a very well thought out complex of activities. Some of the people on my reference list at the end are with the New Economic Institute. What's wrong with the present mindset? Well, it's based in really 17th century theory. Phyllis and I wrote a paper on it in 1982, which we presented in 2002, which we presented at a conference in 2004 and revised in 2008, but I don't think it's on the website yet. We'll get it on the website. The classical paradigm started with what's called the Age of Reason, and it rejected superstition, insisted upon rationality, but it insisted that the human being was in charge of everything. And if you go back to those days, before Darwin, It's very hard to get our mind back to how people thought in those days, because they didn't think of the human being as an animal. They thought of the human being as a completely superior creature who had essentially control of everything. And they got the idea, probably, because they all read Genesis, Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. Let us make man in our image, and let them, already plural, have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, the cattle, and over all the earth. And then 2 verses further on, verse 28, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it. I like that. And have dominion over every living thing. And that was really the driver of the Industrial Revolution, with one additional point. Yes. There's one other factor in the old paradigm which is never mentioned, but when you talk about the old paradigm, it's always the growth paradigm. But the growth paradigm is only one element. There's another element, which is the idea of equating technological advance with progress. And I mentioned before the lecture started the recent paper by Paul and Anne Ehrlich, and they deal a little bit with the question of inappropriate technology. And of course, technological advance isn't always beneficial to the planet, and often it's not beneficial to the human race. But now, what do we replace this with in the new era that I hope is forthcoming? The new holistic paradigm retains rationality at its base, but rejects all the rest and places the web of life at the center. But with a difference that I don't think you find biblically in the New Testament. The difference is that it considers all times the diversity of life and the abundance, not just the human life, but diversity and abundance of all life. And I think this is a step forward from the New Testament, so we're entering the Third Testament, as I call it. I'm writing an essay called The Third Testament. Our native elders have known this for centuries, perhaps millennia, that you have to look at all life and preserve it, even if you are going to kill an animal occasionally in order to eat it. Okay, given the new mentality, the mentality that we're going to concentrate on preserving the web of life, not just human life, is a new economic system possible? Can it work? And what will be its features? Well, I've got 12 features, and it's here. And of course, you can regroup them to make far more or fewer, but that happens to be the number of disciples in the New Testament. Here are the features that the new system will have. The emphasis will be on resources and resource accounting, not on money. Of course, there will have to be accounting for money. If somebody gives you money to go and buy something, you have to give them the change when you get home. But the resource accounting will take a high priority, and it's no coincidence, in my opinion, that the Chrétien government asked the NRT, the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, to create indices for resources, for the resource base of Canada. And they did a very thorough job on this. So what they did was a system, they set up a system whereby you can do resource accounting, at least for the country, not perhaps for a corporation, but for the country. And now, of course, they've been disbanded by the present government. Absolutely essential will be to minimize the extraction of primary resources, especially the fossil fuels, but including trees, minimize the number of trees cut, and maximize the recycling. I've got a little amusing calculation at the end on that. Bring to an end fossil fuel burning, not in one day, of course, but bring it to an end. Fossil fuels are incredibly valuable resources. You know, if I said to you, here's a lump of aluminum, you can burn it in your fireplace, you wouldn't think of doing it. because you'd think this is a precious resource. But people burn oil, and it's a precious resource for other purposes. Adoption by industries of extended producer responsibility. And that's described in Annie Leonard's book, which I'll show, called The Story of Stuff. Annie Leonard. Just look up in the index, and that explains extended producer responsibility. It means that when you design something for a factory to make, you make sure that everything will come back to the factory and you can recycle the same materials through. You also do it by using the minimum energy that you can. An end to planned obsolescence, thank you, Peter, for reminding me of that expression. Controls, I don't think you can ever totally end it, but you can reduce it by a huge factor. Controls or understandings on advertising, because advertising is the mechanism which drives the overconsumption, and it's the mechanism that has created addiction to shopping, for instance. So there'll have to be some kind of understandings or rules about advertising. Encouragement and perhaps standardization of benefit corporations as a legal as well as political matter, and other forms of benign enterprise. There's a whole chapter on this in Gus Speth's new book, which is called America the Possible. Has anybody got the book? It's quite new. Anyway, I've listed it in the references. There are actually many ways that corporations can become less destructive of the environment. I like the benefit corporation as a legal entity, because in the benefit corporation, if it's properly legally set up, the corporation, the board of directors, has responsibility to the public, to the environment, as well as to the shareholders. Under the modern corporation as it exists today, the ordinary corporation, if you go and register for a corporate license in Ontario, you're just responsible to the shareholders. And the fact that you don't pollute is either because you're a good guy and you don't like to pollute, or because you have people watching you and preventing you from doing it. But it's not written into your corporate license that you have to be responsible for these things. There are 6 states in the United States that have set up the legislative basis for benefit corporations. And when Gus Speth wrote his book, there were only 4, so it's developing. As far as I know, there are none in Canada, and I don't know if there are any anywhere else. But this is a very complicated subject, because there are all sorts of other approaches to the same goal. And it's going ahead. I mean, things are getting better to some extent. But none of this has yet affected the really big corporations, like, you know, the ones that are really doing the damage, like Exxon and BP and so on. This is one of mine. These 3 really are my contribution to this subject. Establishment of publicly owned banks in all single currency areas. And I can explain why that is necessary. I happened to see Paul Hellyer not very long ago, and I said I thought this was a good idea. And he responded, he said, "I've thought this as well for years," he said. I said, "Do you think it's necessary for all countries?" He said, "Absolutely. All countries should have a publicly owned national bank, as we have in Canada, the Bank of Canada, and as they don't have in the United States. The Fed is, as most of you know, privately owned." Maintenance of full employment. I consider this very important because it's important in a basic way, but it's very, very important if you want to make the transition from the present economy to the old economy, because the transition is going to put people out of work. For example, if people over the next 30 years stop burning fossil fuels in their automobiles, and if coal is no longer burnt in power plants, it's going to put a lot of people out of work. So you have to create new work. And so it's very essential to focus on full employment. Restoring the commons is my pet one, because if you look at the suggestions that have been made since the crash in 2008. How do we get the economy going again? Everybody's thinking in terms of profit-making endeavors. I'll bet you haven't heard a suggestion on a radio program or a TV program or in the newspapers or otherwise. But there's piles and piles of work to be done in the world on restoring the commons, because we've let fields and forests and lakes and the ocean get into a terrible state. And there are over 700 dead zones in the ocean, 700 dead zones. And the biggest one is at the mouth of the Mississippi. And it measures 48,000 square kilometers. So you've got this absolutely vast dead area. That can be fixed. It can be fixed. And that's what I call restoring the commons. And it's one of the things that the Global Issues project has decided to try and stimulate, getting it done. It will require huge cooperation with the US Department of Agriculture. They would have to do most of the work. But that's just one example of restoring the commons. Greatly reduced social inequities. There are 2 recent books on that, and I'll give you the listing. That means let's reduce the difference between the highest and the lowest incomes by a large factor. And finally, measuring, I mentioned measuring wealth again. We have to measure wealth in terms of resources, not in terms of money. And I know the Secretary General of the Club of Rome is in very strong agreement with that. We discussed it 18 months ago. So those, I'm sure this list isn't complete. That's my list, but there are several things on it which aren't on Gus Speth's list. So I guess that's the end of my talk, and I wanted it to be mostly discussion. Oh yes, 2 more things, or 1 more thing. A start toward a new economy, how do we get it started? Can simply be made by changing what is taxed. So if you change what is taxed, you can start the ball rolling. And no less an economist than Herman Daly, he's a retired economist, academic economist in the United States. He wrote a paper about 20 months ago, 2-page paper which somebody else published. I don't think he wanted to publish it. He said, stop taxing value added and services, stop taxing incomes, and stop taxing corporate profits, tax resources instead. And I think you could go to the polls with a project like that. You know, no income tax, a lot of people would vote for it. Thank you for your